is going on, guys? This is Skyhound, also known as Geek Archivist Xavier Pierce, and welcome to a special episode of Otaku Center of Geek Archivist Podcast. If it hasn't been clear, I am going to be going over at least the first volume of Magic Knight Rayearth, and of course the IP itself, the manga as well as the anime both turn 30 this year. But if we're going to go in chronological order here, the first one was published back in July this month, back in 1994. Now, if you want the actual timestamp, I'm going to have to cite Wikipedia here, despite the fact that it's only good for quick information. The original in Japan was back on the 22nd of July of 1994. Now, the second one was also in the same year, but let me pull up the information from Wikipedia. Give me one moment. So yeah, right here. In Japan, it was released on July 22nd, Volume 1. In case you're wondering, what I'm holding right now, and I'm about to show you this, this is from the 25th edition of it. This, as you can see here. The original, like I said, here's the date. That's the original release date. The second volume, FYI, if you're paying attention to the little intro I did, the second one has Umi Ryuzaki. The third one has Fuhooji. The second one was released in November of the same year. The last one was in March of 1995, a year later. Here on the next column, you see the original ISBN for Japan. Now in North America, it was released all on 1 year in different months. Here's the numbers. Now keep in mind, this was actually done via Tokyo Pop back in the day. If you want a clue, this right here, I used to own it back in the day. I had all 6 of these back then. Now, the art on this is the exact same that you see on the actual art book. But before I go on any further, if you guys like what you see in here, hit that like and subscribe button. So it would at least help not just my channel, but also the algorithm to an extent. With that being said, like I said, I am basically going over volume 1 in general, but technically I should be going over all 3. Now, to be clear, in terms of the genre itself, most would say this was like a magical girl type thing, but there is a genre that's referred to as isekai, basically being transferred from your native surroundings to someplace else entirely through some sort of supernatural or fantastical means, which is essentially what Magic Knight Rayearth technically does. So one can argue that it may have elements of the magical girl genre, but it's just one part of it. So technically, if you want to make an argument about it, this is more isekai than it is magical girl. But the term you're probably looking for is multi-genres. Let me say it again, multi-genres. You have elements of more than one type, Like, for example, you can have mechas or machines, and that's mostly a part of sci-fi, but you can also have action adventure in there. Now, with that being said, since I did use the word machines or mechas, there is a little bit of some notes that was from that's more towards the end of volume 1. Let me pull it up real quick on my end. Give me one moment. Here it is. Let me just pull it up. So this was towards the end of volume 1, particularly right here where it says Rune Gods on page 55. It explains, in the various English language editions of Magic Knight Rayearth, Rune Gods is a long-standing translation for the term machine. The characters used for the term are ma, meaning demon or evil spirit, but also connotating magic, quote unquote, and shin, meaning God. Now, here's the thing. The problem when it comes to people who don't understand not just religions, but also the fact that there is the all-knowing God that is known by Jews and Christians with the capital. Then you have the, how do I put this, pagan ones, or the other that are not pertaining to those religious beliefs. Those are in the lower G, not the capital G, lower, if I'm not being clear. But in terms of linguistics, you can argue that it's also in reference to trying to make a certain term make sense in the context and usage of the term itself. So it's going on. It says, taken literally, this invented word would mean something like a magical god. Again, the G there is lowercase to a Japanese reader, but its pronunciation would also bring to mind the English word machine. So in this case, one can argue this is basically almost like a borrowed term. So in this case, it's saying machine is therefore a pun meant to foreshadow their nature as giant robots. Rune God is a reasonable, albeit incomplete, translation of the term. And rather than break with tradition and translate it differently, or simply preserve machine as is, the translation you hold in your hands defers to the established English language terminology to avoid further muddying the waters. So, with that in mind, I'm going to argue a little bit about language here and translations. And of course, I'm going to have to pick, butt heads with the anti-localizations and the localization community. Despite me going for English language and literature, and I know for those who are studying different languages, I know some of you guys have said, I pity the fool that has to deal with English language compared to native languages. And you know what? You guys are totally 120% correct. And here's why. The numerous rules, regulations, and if I'm going to be going technical here, you have syntax, you also have phonetics, among other things. When it comes to studying languages and how they were made, and you're also adding historical context, among other things, the cultures of these countries. On top of that, how it formed and everything else. I can go technical and historical as much as I want, but you get the gist. It is not easy. Those that have studied languages, they get the idea. But I'll be 120% clear here. Me bashing Americans, narcissistic Americans, for 2 generations who keep going on about themselves, who don't know these IPs and the like. This is what we keep bashing about. You guys weren't around before the internet existed. You guys weren't around when these IPs were around. But since you keep having the internet, you keep saying, oh, we've had this, for a long time. Well, guess what? I understand history, media better than you guys. And you keep going on about yourselves and so-called oppression. You keep using words that you never learned or even understand. If you want anyone to blame, blame yourself, your choices, as well as the people who raised you. That is on you, not people like me or anyone else for that matter. With that little rant out of the way, I want to be clear here that when it comes to trying to make certain differences make sense, it is not easy, especially when it comes to going from the native language to others. The funny thing is, there are those who have watched it in their native language, even though this was from Japan. Now, keep in mind, it wasn't just here. I can arguably say that those in Mexico or even Spain, they also know of this anime. They have it translated in their native language. So, frankly, they're just as familiar with this compared to Americans because they also had a time, like I said, before the internet existed, they watched it in a certain way. Now, with regards to volume one, let me go through my notes here real fast. The first episode of Magic Knight Rayearth, at least if I'm going to be covering this in terms of volume, one, basically page 3 up to roughly 115 of volume 1 covers the entire first episode. Now, in terms of going from manga to anime, I'll be clear here that there are some moments in the anime that are filler that do not pertain to the manga. So I apologize in advance if I got my numbers wrong here in terms of ratio. But if I had to say faithful translations, or not translations, transition, there we go. Faithful transitions, I'd argue maybe 30% of the anime is 70% manga, or I probably got the number switched around because there are moments in the anime that's different from how the manga translates it to. So, if you want a clear example, let me go back to episode 1 for a little bit. There is a particular moment in there where, let me pull it up. So there's a point where the 3 girls, Hikaru, Umi, and Fu, they're over Tokyo Tower over at a tour by their respective schools going over there. And we also learn a bit about their personalities later on as it goes on. But the gist is, as they get summoned to Saphira, let me pull up those particular pages. So I'm going to be referencing pages 18, 19, and 20 and maybe 21. So give me a second. As you can see here, I have the box over. You can sort of see the reflection of the box here as I pulled it out. So this is from page 18 and 19. So when they get summoned, there's this part right here. They kind of go a bit on the I don't know if I'd say horror aspect of it, but kind of like magic horror to a degree. The difference being is that you don't see this on the very first episode. So this part right here, you don't see that because in the anime version, what actually happens is the ground literally disappears from their feet. Instead of this happening, because I think it might have to do more, I'm just gonna spitball here, with not just animation, but they think it wouldn't be as realistic and it might not have um, flowed better in terms of what was going on and how to make it make sense. On top of that, the other thing was that I'm going to slightly deviate just a little bit. Give me 1 second. So I'm going to switch gears here just a little bit. Again, since this was in the 90s, and this was published back in the mid 1990s to late 90s. I want to point out here the stuff you had back then before the internet existed. You didn't have smartphones, you didn't have streaming services. We had Blockbuster back in the day, video rental stores. You had VHS, you had cassette tapes, you had the short-lived laser discs. Long before you had the DVDs, laser discs existed, and you also had CDs. Now, laser discs, those were roughly this thick, but heavier than your vinyl discs, which are paper thin. Now, before I forget, when they did the OAV for Rayearth, same IP, but more of an alternate universe type thing. You had it both on Laserdisc as well as cassette tapes. Now, considering that they had to divide it into 3 chapters, to an extent, almost kind of like how they did with the manga, I did cover that in a previous episode. Now, to get back to some differences between manga and anime, there is one thing that is a little different in terms of how the spells were utilized. Well, I don't know if I would say utilized, but the way they tried to spell it. Let me get to a certain page here. Give me one moment. So right here, this is from page 91 of volume 1. We see here that Alcyone is a user of ice magic. They pronounce it a little differently, even though, it's spelled differently, but the pronunciation is Raya, except here on the spelling, it's Allaia, but it's supposed to read as Araya. So in your head, it almost sounds like Arya. While that is roughly the same as this, she's basically using her ice dagger attack here. The next page, however, is a barrier spell that Clef uses. But the difference is here, I'm going to go a little bit into linguistics. It's Cresta. Now, as you can sort of see, obviously Alcyone was a student of Clef's. But to go a little further here, I had to record or screen record at least what I found from the OAV, which is a little different. I apologize in advance if the sound is a little bit off, but again, this is from the Japanese dub. I do have it in English. There is a difference between the two. I will eventually be going over it again at some point. But just to give some context, here is how it sounds from the original. So I apologize in advance if it's very low and it's hard to hear. But Alcyone uses a spell, another spell, Astra, Astra. That's another ice spell of hers. Now, Clef, he used that same barrier spell as you just saw, Krista, but again, spelling wise, you get at least the gist of the spell. Now, in terms of episode 2, it starts roughly from 116 to 164. This is roughly after they get sent. I mean, the three girls get sent by Clef to a particular forest to find the smith maker, Persea, who is going to be able to forge weapons for the girls to become magic knights. Now, with episode 3, I'll be clear here. From the manga, it kind of cuts off a little bit. So from 165 to 197, you get parts of it. But when you get to volume 2, again, the pages start a little differently. I'd say from page 3 up to page 40 approximately, you get the end of that episode to an extent. But again, there are differences between manga and anime in terms of what's covered. Now, I will admit that when it comes to certain details, again, there are fillers that is not covered in the manga. That's different from the anime. I will have to make note of it again at some point. But I do want to sidestep once more and go over some convention stories meeting some of the VAs. One in particular was one that I met back in 2009, and that was Barbara Goodson over at Anime Expo. Now, to give some context here, my very first convention was Anime Expo, but the first time I went was back in 2007. 2009 was when they moved to LA, which is now the permanent residence. At the time, before I learned about Power Morphicon, which is a convention for Power Rangers, there's your clue. Barbara Goodson. For Power Ranger fans, you know her as Rita Repulsa. However, Barbara Goodson is also talented in doing anime characters. Namely, she did Alcyone for Magic Knight Rayearth. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. The voice of Rita Repulsa for Power Rangers did Alcyone for this anime. The thing was, I did manage to find a little something. Give me one moment here. So right here, I'm just referencing another YouTuber. Quick shout out to Yuan Hyuga. This right here was back in 2009. As you can see, obviously right here, Robert Axelrod. Fans only recognize him as Lord Zed. However, he also did Finster. For anime fans, I'll be clear here. What's pretty obvious, I'm sure those two work together in certain anime. You just have to look around. Robert Axelrod, rest in peace, sir. I got the chance to meet the guy. He actually was in Digimon. He played Wizardmon as well as Ankylomon, the Digivolution of Armadillomon. Me going over my little geek history here. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Barbara Goodson, who, like I said, she was in Power Rangers. Now, the thing was, she was the only one that I felt comfortable talking about Japanese anime because as soon as I saw the picture and I knew she did Alcyone, I don't remember much in terms of what I asked her, but I'm sure the memories they're buried somewhere. But besides that, she wasn't the only one that I met at the time. Fast forward a couple decades later, and I went over to another anime convention called Anime Riverside. Of course, I eventually moved. But just to give some context here, I actually met with um, Lex Lang, a legendary voice actor, as well as his wife, Sandy Fox. You want proof? Fine. I'll give you guys some proof here. Let me just pull up something on my end. There's your proof, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, this was taken from season 1 of the anime, and obviously Lex Lang voiced Zagato. However, that wasn't the only character he played. If you look it up on IMDb, he also voiced another character here. This Rayearth that belongs to Hikaru. He also did Wyndham as well. And since I'm bringing up Volume 1, I met Lex Lang again over at Power Morphicon. And I got him to sign this. So there's your proof. That line is probably the only one that's the easiest for him to remember. I mean, I wouldn't put it past him. There is a funny little story here, and it had to do with getting something signed. And I wanted to give it to him because, well, I was just trying to be nice and all of that. Give me one moment. Okay, right here. This funny little story. I had I had drawn this in anticipation to just wanting to give this to Mr. Lex Lang as a little gift, but he told me, you know what, that's fine. I'm just gonna take a picture of it though, because I know he didn't want to damage it. My fault for not bringing a sort of sheet protector to actually, preserve it, but he signed it for me for free. And kudos to him for remembering the sound of the character, but the spelling was off, as you can see here. It's supposed to spell P U U. So I apologize if it sounds like I'm saying PU, but you get the idea. And I'm not bashing him against this though. I know he knows the character. I know he knows the sound of it because well, we discussed a bit about it, the IP in general, and this was just fun. And before I forget, when I did bring this when I did bring volume 1 to actually go over it with him, he did tell me that he did like the fact that the animators actually were able to um, transition a particular scene from pages to animation. To give a certain context here, this is what we discussed about this part right here, where Zagato is actually meeting with his minions. In this case, it's I apologize again if I forget. I forget the name of the one who has a relation to Tatra and Tarta in season 2 of this IP. But the other ones that I remember are La Farga, Ascot, and Alcione. Those were ones that were going against the Magic Knights in season 1. So he was telling me about how he liked how the animators were able to make the animation, come to life from there. Now, overall, I will say that it wasn't just him that I met, but I also did meet his wife, Sandy Fox. For those of you who don't know, she actually voices Lady Asuka in season 2, but she's also been known to play a few other characters. Namely, she was in Ghost in the Shell, the TV anime, not the movie, just to be clear, but she also voices Chibiusa, not just in Crystal, but they also did the redubbing of the original 90s anime. Now, again, there are differences, like I said, between what's covered. But overall, I did hear recently, actually yesterday, that since it's the 30th anniversary, excuse me, they're actually going to do an animation project for Magic Knight Rayearth. Yeah, I just heard about it yesterday. I did a tweet about it. I will put a link in the description below. I apologize in advance. This is actually in Japanese, but it is happening for the 30th anniversary because season 1, when they started it, was actually in October of 1994. So if you do the math, manga, first 2 volumes was in the same year, but volume 1 was in July. And again, let me just point out on the date. The second one was in November, volume 2, by the way. The anime started in October of that year. You get the picture? But yeah, anyway, this is just me going over at least volume 1 to an extent. And also, I want to say kudos and congrats to the ladies over at Clamp for doing such a phenomenal job on this IP that has been beloved by many and also unknown to others. So, with that being said, hope you guys enjoyed this little overview and general analysis of Magic Knight Rayearth. And if you guys are planning on watching it, I know I'm going to try to at least. But again, this has been Skyhound, also known as Geek Archivist Xavier Pierce. Stay safe, stay sane, and as my good friend Orange Hat would say, stay humble. Peace.